Alan's got our scripture reading, but I'm going to go ahead and start for a minute and then have him read, do part of the introduction first so that we can put it in the place where I have it in my notes. Our lesson title comes, maybe it's influenced by a famous comedian. I don't know. I call it You Might Be a Prodigal. And if you know what that reference is, then you know it, but it's not funny necessarily, but it could be maybe. I don't know. Tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to Jesus, and they wanted to hear him teach, and it was associated, the thing that brought them oftentimes is they wanted to judge the people that he was teaching to. We've talked the last several weeks, and we've talked about the lost sheep and the idea that the sheep was lost and it knew it was lost, but it didn't know any way to find its way home, and how as we studied the story of the sheep, many of us too have wandered away. We saw something shiny and we walked away for a minute. We looked closer at the roses or stopped to smell the roses, and we looked and the parade had already gone by and we were left behind. We weren't sure how to find our way back to where we needed to be. And so that was a difficult thing, and many of us have experienced being the lost sheep. We talked about the coin that was lost. It was lost through no fault of its own, but it didn't know it was lost. You know, we know many people in the world that are lost, and they don't know they're lost. Some of us have been lost, and we didn't know we were lost, but that the widow or the lady, the woman in the story, she diligently sought for the coin until the coin was found and recovered. And last week we talked about the son, the one who chose to walk away from everything. You know, and there are some of us who have chosen at times in our life to just totally turn around and turn our backs on God. And praise God, that little verse there that we like so well, when he came to his senses. Praise God that we can come to our senses, and when we come to our senses, we can come back. And God lets us come back. I love that. I have a book in my shelf in there. It's called God Allows U-Turns. Aren't you glad God allows U-turns? Aren't you glad for that? I'm thankful for that. But here we see in what's going to happen here, the first two verses kind of set it up. And we see there three different groups of people. There's Jesus, and then there's all these sinners, the tax collectors, the nobodies that are flocking to Jesus, and the disreputable people. And then there's a third category. These are the people who are thought of as the spiritual giants. And I think it's important every time we go through this that we remind ourselves who he's talking to. You know, I was always told that you read stuff in context if you want to know what it really means. And so reading it in context, we understand who is Jesus talking to. These are the spiritual giants. They're the ones that they measured their church membership in generations. I'm a fifth generation member of the church. My father was a member of the church. His father was a member of the church. My grandfather was an elder. My great-grandfather led singing. My great-great-grandfather cleaned the building. You know, I've been a part of this church since the church began. I am a member. They always wore their coats and ties. They always were dressed properly, and they had their attendance pins. You know, I've never missed a... Y'all remember when they used to give out attendance pins for Bible class? I remember those. The ones they gave out at Holden Avenue clicked. People be sitting there all through services that day clicking those little pins. It was like instrumental music almost. I don't know. But these folks are the true believers. They've sacrificed for their faith. They know where their faith is founded. They're so good and so righteous and so dedicated in following God, they couldn't imagine somebody else wandering off. And why in the world would you wander away from something this great? They couldn't imagine somebody being lost and not seeing that they were lost and wanting to be a part of what they were a part of. They could not even dream of somebody intentionally walking out the doors and not coming back. I mean, they just couldn't imagine that. They've been faithful their whole lives. Why in the world would anybody not be faithful? Them? Why in the world would Jesus hang out with the kind of people that he's hanging out with? We'd never hang out with a bunch of drunks, people that curse, people that carouse and things like that. We'd never hang out with anybody like that. And if he's hanging out with people like that, there's probably a problem with him. That's the way they looked at it. They're dedicated to their faith. We need to see that. And Jesus doesn't question that. Not even once does he question their dedication. Throughout the entire New Testament, when he has problems with the scribes and the Pharisees, he never questions their commitment or their dedication. But he does question their hearts. He does question where they come from. They're so offended by Jesus, they're essentially saying Jesus is watering down the faith. He's just letting anybody in. He's just accepting everybody, and he's watering down the faith. Sure, you can get big crowds. If you don't teach the whole truth, you can get all kinds of big crowds, but he's not teaching the whole truth. They thought he was a liberal. That's what they thought of Jesus. So in Luke 15, Jesus tells us 3 stories. As we've already mentioned, you know the 3 stories very well. It's the story of the sheep, the story of the coin, the story of the son. All 3 were lost, and thank goodness they all 3 were recovered, and we understand that. But then Jesus turns up the heat on these contented church folks. He doesn't end at the story of the prodigal son like we usually do. He doesn't stop there. And in fact, the part we usually read is just a setup for the punchline, if you will. And that's what we're going to have, is the punchline that comes up. We're going to start in verse 25. Alan's going to read for us.
We'll be reading from 25 to 32. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field, and as he approached the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of his servants and asked what was going on. "Your brother has returned," he said, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older son became angry and refused to go in. So his father came out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've served you and never disobeyed a commandment of yours. Yet you never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours returns from squandering your wealth with prostitutes, you killed a fattened calf for him." "Son, you are always with me," the father said, "and all that is mine is yours. But it was fitting to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found."
You know, I love the story. I love the narrative that we have here in Luke 15 as we read this story about this prodigal son, is the way we usually refer to it, about this life that's so important to God. And I think it's important as we do this and as we read this that we understand what Jesus is trying to get across is not about lost sheep. Sheep are not important. We are the sheep. We are the people of his pasture. We are his flock. He's talking about people. When he talks about lost coins, he's not talking about coins. He's talking about the value of a soul. When he talks about lost sons, he's talking about his own sons who have turned their back on him and how desirous he is for them to return. And then he comes around and he says, "But you faithful ones, you're who I'm talking to in all of these stories." And they didn't realize that. I think it must have been for them a really strong catch there. I think there must have been a really difficult thing here. Look what this picture paints of the relationship between the son and his father. There's a couple of indications in the text there. He doesn't call him father or dad. He doesn't refer to him like that at all. You know, he doesn't reference it. There's a disconnect in their relationship there, and the only term he can muster, and it maybe, I don't particularly care for the contemporary English version, but maybe it covers this as well as anything else when he says basically, "I've been your slave all these years." He didn't feel like a son toward a father. He felt like a slave towards a master. He felt obligated to be there. He felt obligated to be a part of the family. And that's the only term he uses there. And the other indication we see for how he feels towards his father is he doesn't go in the house. He doesn't go in the house. Not only does he not go in the house, he doesn't call the father and say, "Dad, what's going on? Why is there a big party going on?" As the oldest son, it would have been his job to co-host the party. He should have immediately said, "Oh my goodness, there's a party. He needs me." I need to get in there and help. I need to be doing my job. I need to be greeting guests. I need to be making sure that their cups are full. I need to be making sure that the servants are doing what they're supposed to do. I might need to get out of my field clothes and get into my fine clothes so that I can be there and co-host this party that I'm supposed to be co-hosting. But he doesn't do any of that. No, and he doesn't go to his father and say, Dad, what's going on? He calls one of the servants. Hey, what's going on in the house? Got a question. If you came home from a hard day's work, you've been working all day long, and you come home and there's a great big party going on in your house, do you ask some of the people that are out there parking cars what's going on, or do you go into your house to find out what's going on? No, he asks one of the servants, and when he finds out it's a party for his brother, he ain't going in. He ain't going in there. And I know ain't's not a word, but it's appropriate in that usage. At least for me. How do we know if we've become so content in residing in our Father's house that we're not willing to accept our brother when he's being honored? You know, as good church people, how do we know when we're edging away from our relationship with our Father to the point where instead of saying, Dad, what's going on? Listen, I've been a slave for you all these years. You owe me an explanation. Because that's where this boy had fallen to. And we need to understand that. So Jesus gives us 3 signs of a life outside of a relationship with the Father. And this morning I want us to check ourselves by weighing ourselves against these 3 signs. And I call it, you might be the second prodigal. That's just what I titled it because I thought it was funny when I was trying to figure out a way to say it. But you might be the second prodigal if you lift up your own righteousness. You know, in the contemporary English version, again in verse 29, he says, For I've worked for you like a slave and always obeyed you. And that term always is a pretty big word sometimes. You know, if you hear in a heated discussion, especially with your spouse or somebody like that, if they use the word always, you always, or always this or that, don't start arguing about always, okay? You're going to lose that argument. The argument's not about always. The argument's about whatever it is that you do or don't do. And if you start arguing about always, you're on the wrong part and you're going to get in a lot of trouble. But as you hear that term, always means always to the person saying it usually. They've neglected everything other than the points that they're thinking about. And you may ask yourself, George, how do you know that what the older brother said wasn't true? That he wasn't always there? And here's how I know. Because, number one, he was supposed to be there to co-host the party, but instead of joining it, he's pouting out back. And by simply staying out back, he's dishonoring his father in front of the guests. You know, we don't think of that, but that minor infraction never dawns on him. And he sees his faithfulness as a step up on the competition. I mean, look at this. This son of yours was out doing blah, 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 but look at how faithful I've been. I haven't done anything like that. He lifts up his own self-righteousness. He says, I've always obeyed you. And the truth is, he's never really obeyed. Not from the heart, which is what matters. He doesn't know anything about obedience. Oh, he knows a lot about conformity. He knows a whole lot about following orders, but he knows nothing of the obedience that comes from a loving heart. He's been baptized. He takes communion every single Sunday. He would never dream of worshiping God in an unauthorized manner, but his heart's not there. We've known people like that. As I said when we started studying Luke 15, there are at least 8 different groups of people as we look through the sheep and the coin and the son and the other son and the father and the friends and all of those. There are several different groups of shoes there. And as I said earlier, most of us have worn at least one and sometimes more than one pair of those shoes. We've been in these shoes, and as we look, we may see ourselves a little bit. I hope not as much in some as in others. But as we look at that, sometimes we know somebody like that, or sometimes we've been somebody like that. Oh, we've been right. We always want to make sure we're right. We've done the right thing for the right reasons at the right time, right without fail. But Isaiah tells us in Isaiah 55 that even our most righteousness, our most righteous acts, are to God as minstrel cloths. In some of your English translations, it says filthy rags. Our most righteous acts don't make us right in God's eyes. Even when we're at our most right, we're not all right. You know, it's important for us to understand that, and the question is, how do you grade yourself spiritually? How do you grade yourself? And I'm not talking about comparative grades like I'm better than the next guy. You know, I grew up in a school where we graded on the curve. Had a math teacher that gave us a trick question one time. He said, would you like to have a curve like in all your other classes, or would you like to have a bell curve? And we're like, a bell curve? What's a bell curve? He said, a bell curve is a true curve. And we're all, oh yes, we'd like to have a true curve. You know what a true curve is? For every A, you have an F. For every D, you have a B, and exactly half the class gets a C. Now, do you want that now? Or do you want to know that when Judd sets the high score with a 97, 97 becomes the high score, and you've only got to have 90% of 97 instead of 90% of 100? God doesn't grade on the curve. No, God grades on grace. But the letter is set, the grade is set by Jesus Christ, who was perfect. Had a friend in high school. In biology class, it was horrible. He was the worst friend you could possibly have in so many ways, because in biology class, our biology teacher graded on the curve. And what he did was, there were 3,600 or whatever total possible points in the class, but this friend of mine turned in over 3,000 points of extra credit. So he had 6,000 and some odd points in the class, and the curve was 90% of that, and there's only 3,600 possible. So that means the best you can do is a D. If you make perfect scores on everything, you can get a D in class. Well, that means you got to do a whole lot of extra stuff outside of class. Like I said, didn't like my friend very much at that time. It was challenging and almost impossible. But you see, that's where we are when we stand facing Jesus. He did so much, so well, so perfectly, that when we try to compare everything we've ever done, even if we live our lives to the best that we possibly can from the first moment we know of God, we got a D. We got a D. And a D's not really passing, is it? And I would say most of us haven't been perfect. And so we're looking at F's. Thank God for grace. Thank God for grace. But when we stand in the face of God and we're left naked with no place to hide, how do we grade out when it really comes down to just us and God? Because it's appointed for man once to die, and after that the judgment. All of us are going to face the judgment throne of God. All of us are going to answer for the things we've done in the flesh. There's a verse that speaks to this that's so important. Psalm 51 and verse 6, surely you desire truth in the inner parts. Can we be honest with God? Can we be honest in our hearts with God and our relationship with Him? Are we ready to resign our reliance on our own righteousness and understand that it comes down to His righteousness? Are we ready to confess that sin does sometimes take hold in part of our lives, and that yes, in fact, oftentimes as we look through these parables, we see ourselves in many different pairs of the shoes? You know, there's a party going on in heaven right now over one soul that repents. There is. Do we find ourselves rejoicing, or do we find ourselves standing outside and wondering? You might be the second prodigal if you lift up your own righteousness and forget about our own sins. Number two, you might be the second prodigal if you blow up the sins of others. Look at this in verse 30. Yet when this son of yours comes back, you notice how he refers to his little brother? He doesn't say, my brother. He says, your son. That's what a stranger says. You know, uncles and cousins and friends, they all know your children by name. They say, hey, how is Billy Bob? How is Edward? How is whoever? But strangers, they don't know. Hey, is that your son? How's your son? I don't know him. That's the words and the terminology he's using here. You know, parents do the same kind of thing. At our house, when Brian did something really, really good, I'd say, that's my son right there. When he didn't do something very good or he did something that was maybe even wrong, Gail would say, he's your son. Parents, you ever do that? Sure we do. Let's be honest with each other. We do that kind of thing. That's something, but look again at verse 30. There's a phrase there that maybe has passed your reading as you read this. Sometimes we read this and we don't see everything that we see. But it says, yet when this son of yours comes back after squandering your money on prostitutes. That's a really interesting part of Jesus' story here. You know, where in the first part of the story does it mention prostitutes? You ever think about that? Here's the answer. It doesn't. It doesn't anywhere mention prostitutes. The first part of the story says he wasted his money on reckless living. You know, there could be moral implications there, but it could be that he went out and he just blew all his money buying frivolous things. He went out and bought a new Ferrari. He went out and he bought a house he couldn't afford. He went out and he spent his money. He bought gifts for everybody and all his friends. He just wasted his money left and right. It never says that he wasted his money in sinful living. He said he wasted his money in reckless living. I think sometimes we, as we read this story, have been just as guilty of the older brother of saying, well, now he went out and he squandered his money on blah, 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 sinful living. That's not what it says. It doesn't say that at all. It says he spent it recklessly. And I think that's important that we understand that. Where did the idea of prostitution even come from? Older brother made it up. It's made it up. Maybe he wants to paint as bad a picture as he can about his brother. Maybe that's what he wants to do, so he takes the little bit he knows and he blows the story up to make it even worse. Maybe that's what's going on here. I don't know that. I wasn't there. It's a parable. It's not real. Jesus is telling a story so that we can get learning from the story itself. But you know, it's interesting that sometimes we, when we might be the older brother, are quick to judge the thoughts and actions of our younger brothers when they fail. You know, it starts like this a lot of times. I know nobody here has ever experienced it, but as I share this little tiny parable, you might have seen it on TV maybe. It's a cup of coffee, and we're drinking a cup of coffee, and all of a sudden somebody says, you know, there's something I need to share with you. This is not gossip. But I just wanted to share it with you so you could be praying for this family because such and 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 such. And the gossip just pours out. But as long as we say it's not gossip, and as long as we say it so we can pray for them, it's okay, right? Except for what we don't always take into consideration, gossipers are listed with murderers and adulterers as those who will be in hell. We think, well, it's just a little gossip. Just a little murder? Just a little adultery? No, there's no such thing as just a little, is there? There's no such thing as just a little. Sometimes I think we can find ourselves with a negative judgmental spirit that just continually bubbles up inside of us. Maybe we gossip a little bit. Maybe we just reflexively find fault with other people. Maybe we just, it's not that we're lifting ourselves up because we would never do that. That would be prideful and wrong. But if we can put others down just a little bit, it's the same effect, right? And so maybe we do things like that. Maybe we like being the judge and the jury. just a little bit. So if we lift up our own righteousness and we blow up the sins of others, then we might be the second prodigal. But there's one more sign of a life outside of a proper relationship with God that we find. We might be the second prodigal if we hold up the Father's offer of grace, if we get in the way. If we get in the way. You know, sometimes it's kind of hard. This is kind of where the rubber meets the road for us sometimes. This is where those two previous things kind of collide with each other. We're lifting ourselves up and we're pushing them down so much that they can't get to the Father because they can't get past us. You know, it's sad sometimes that we can get in the way of people trying to come to God. I had a preacher friend. He was telling about a situation. He was preaching at a church in Detroit, in the inner part of Detroit. And while he was there, he noticed that there were several people visiting that were wearing tattoos. And he decided that he was going to try to talk to them, but they kept getting out quickly. He finally managed to talk to one of the guys and found out that the guy was a former preacher who had had a motorcycle accident. When he got hurt, he had got addicted to hydrocodone, which is, by the way, a very real thing in this world that we live in today. We can see that all around us and the effects of that. But that after he had spent some time in jail, he had come back to Christ, and he was bringing his friends to church. And so the preacher thought it would be a great idea if they set up a tattoo parlor in the basement of the church so that they could bring all these folks in. Now, I'm going to tell you right off the bat, we have a basement. I'm not in favor of putting a tattoo parlor in the church building. I am not in favor of putting a tattoo parlor in the basement of the church building. But I am in favor of us welcoming people into our congregation that have tattoos. I am in favor of us welcoming people in that come in that's got blue hair or green hair or purple hair. I don't care what color your hair. We've got people that come to our church that don't have any hair at all. You know that? How great is that? Yeah, got some volunteers here. Hey, look at me. I got a shiny head. No. You know, we need to be a people where everyone can come closer to God and we can bring them closer to God. Jesus said, by this will all men know you're my disciples, not because you have the right doctrines, but because you love one another. Must you have the right doctrine? Yes, you must. Were the Pharisees and scribes right for having the right doctrine? Yes, they were. But their hearts weren't right. And that's what Jesus was talking about. It's not just about the right doctrine, it's about the right heart. We must have this heart for one another. Here's one that maybe you've experienced in your life. I want to see a show of hands here for just a minute. How many of you have 2 or more children? Go ahead, hold your hands up, 2 or more children. Okay, now, put your hands down if you've never had a child complain that they didn't get treated as well as one of the other kids did. Yeah, go ahead and put your hands down. You don't want to get your arms tired. I mean, you know, here's the older brother. Well, he gets the fatted calf. He gets a ring. He gets a robe. He gets a party. You never gave me a ring. You never gave me a party. You never gave me a robe. You never gave me new shoes. Here I am. I've been here the whole time. I've been faithful. It's not fair. Just like our kids. Well, she got a bigger piece of cake. Well, you let him stay out later. Well, you never spanked her as hard as you spanked me. Well, you grounded me for 2 whole weeks for this, and you only grounded her for a week. It's not fair. Ever heard it? Think God might hear it all the time? You think God might hear it all the time? It's just not fair. You know, so-and-so got to be a deacon, and I didn't get to be a deacon. So-and-so got to be an elder, and I didn't get to be an elder. So-and-so, they have this, God gave them a gift, and they can stand up and they can lead singing, and I can't even carry a tune in a bucket. Boy, I relate to that. But I see it, and I hear it, and I wonder sometimes if we're not just like that older brother. Why don't they let me do more? Why don't they use me? And it's just not fair. It's just not fair. But there's a party going on. Remember? He came in from the field. He heard the sound of music and dancing. There's a party going on. People are rejoicing. The father is rejoicing. But the older brother's outside because he's pouting. He's pouting. He didn't get what he wanted. It's not fair. Life's not fair. You know, my dad told me a long time ago, life's not going to be fair. Life's not fair. He said, just accept it, that life's not fair. You'll work real hard and somebody else will get a promotion. Anybody here experienced that? Sure you have. You'll do whatever for the best of your ability and somebody else will be able to do it better. Anybody ever experienced that? I grew up, I wanted to be a catcher. I wanted to be a catcher for the New York Yankees. You know what? I wasn't good enough. I wasn't good enough. There was somebody that was better than me. And maybe, I don't know, that's a matter of opinion. But then the dad says this interesting thing to him. My son. That's what most of our translations. Your translation have my son or does it have child? My child. You see, the Greek word that's used there is not the usual word for just son. The Greek word that's used there is what you would call your little baby that you're holding in your arms. The father looks down at his son and he says, my baby, the one that I love, the one that I cherish, the one that I see as absolute perfection in my arms, you, my son. He looks at him, he says, look, my dear son. And he says, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. You see, our Father in heaven wants us to know that we're always with him. Our Father in heaven wants us to know that we're valuable in his sight. Our Father in heaven wants us to know that even though we may be judgmental sometimes, even though we may not be the lost one that came back, he still loves us too. He hasn't quit loving us because we're faithful. And he doesn't quit loving us when we're less than faithful. What he's saying is, you're still of so much value to me. What he says is, I've been sitting here worried sick over my lost son, your brother, and now he's back. I've been waiting and watching every day to see if he'd come back, and now he's back. And I'm so thankful to have him back. Now I can hold both of my sons. That's what the Father wants in this parable. That's what the Father wants. And then Jesus stops. We never know whether the older son goes into the house. He doesn't tell us. He doesn't tell us. And the older son repented and decided to go into the house. He doesn't tell us. And the older son decided he didn't want to have anything to do with the party, and he turned around and went back out in the field. He doesn't tell us what happened. Have you ever noticed that? Wouldn't you like for Jesus to have finished the story? Here's the answer. The story isn't finished yet. Because you and I sometimes are that older brother. And we still haven't made our decision. Are we going to sit out on the porch and pout? Or are we going to go in the house and celebrate? Which are we going to do? Henry Nouwen, the author, recalls a visit to the museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. He spent hours reflecting on Rembrandt's portrayal of the prodigal son. I'm reading this part because I wouldn't remember it. But as the day wore on, authors see things differently than the rest of us do sometimes. As the day wore on, changes in the natural lighting from a nearby window left Nouwen with the impression he was seeing as many different paintings as there were changes of light as he looked at this painting of the prodigal son. Each seemed to reveal something different about the father's love for his broken son. He describes how at about 4 o'clock, 3 figures in the painting seemed to step forward as the light changed. One was the older son who resented his father's willingness to roll out the red carpet for the homecoming of the younger brother, the prodigal. Like I said, an author. After all, hadn't he squandered so much of the family fortune and caused him pain and embarrassment in the process? The other two reminded him of the religious leaders who were present as Jesus told his parable. They're the ones who muttered in the background about the very sinners that Jesus was attracting. I wonder sometimes, where are we in these parables in Luke 15? Where are we? Where are you? Are you the sheep that saw something shiny? I mean, it's that easy. I just got distracted for a few minutes, and I was walking in step with God, and I was walking right beside Jesus, and he and I were best buddies and best friends, and I was truly in love with my Savior, and something distracted me for a few minutes, and I looked around, and all of a sudden, here I don't know how to get back. Is that where you are this morning? Do you need help finding your way back? Are you the lost coin? You're valuable. Oh, you're so valuable. You're so valuable that the woman turned the house upside down looking for you. You're so valuable that she threw a party and invited all her friends to tell them when she found you, she's so glad. You're so valuable to God, but you don't even know you're lost. And you need somebody to point out to you, hey, you know what? Am I lost? Am I saved? Are you sure this morning? Maybe you're the son. Hey, you know what? I don't care. I don't care about all the blessings that I had in church. I just want to live my own life for a while. I'm sick and tired of all this having to do and being with and all this other stuff and all those hypocrites at church. I don't want to be around them. I'm just going to go out and live my own life. And maybe you've come to your senses and it's time to come home. Maybe you're like that father. Many of us here have experienced the hurt or the pain of someone. Maybe you're like the shepherd or the woman, the hurt or the pain of someone that we know and care for that's lost or that's wandered away. And we've prayed and longed for them just as the Father did. Till seeing them afar off, we recognize and run and fall on them and show them our love. Maybe you've experienced that. Maybe we've been like the older brother. Well, now, I understand that so-and-so can be forgiven, but I'm just not so sure they can be restored to full membership in the church. Really? Where's that doctrine in the Bible? I tell you something. One of these days, I and you will stand before the judgment throne of God. And when that time comes that I stand in front of the judgment throne of God, I have only one hope. I have only one hope, that Jesus steps in between me and God. And that he says, this one's one of mine. I love Jesus. I love the Lord. I look forward to that day because I think he will. I trust that he will because he said he would. And so when the time comes for me to do that, I look forward to that day. But how sad it would be on that day if Jesus were to treat me as I have sometimes treated some of my brothers and sisters. Well, George is a pretty good old boy, and he did come back, but you know he did this and 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 this. I don't want that on Judgment Day. Do you? Do you? When I face the throne of God, and I throw myself on the mercy of the court, I want Jesus to step in front of me and say, here's the price that was paid for this one. And so as I go through my daily life, when I see my brothers or sisters stumble, when I see my brothers or sisters struggle, I have to remember they too have the exact same atonement for their sins as I do for mine. And who am I to judge another servant? Maybe this morning you need to respond to the Lord's invitation. Maybe you need to be baptized. You've never put Jesus on in baptism. Paul says if we are baptized into Christ, that means we were outside of Christ before we were baptized. There's no other way to get around that. He actually says it twice just to make sure we understand it. We're baptized in it. Maybe you've never been baptized into Christ and you're still outside of Christ. You need to be baptized. Maybe you're a child of God that needs to come back. Whatever your needs are, won't you come while we stand and sing to encourage you?